Wolf Larsen took the distribution of whiskey off my hands, and the bottles began to make their appearance while I worked over the fresh batch of wounded men in the forecastle. And it was with great relief that I again emerged on deck and went aft to the cabin. Supper was ready, and Wolf Larsen and Maud were waiting for me. While all his ship was getting drunk as fast as it could, he remained sober. Not a drop of liquor passed his lips. He did not dare under the circumstances, for he had only Louis and me to depend upon, and Louis was even now at the wheel. We were sailing on through the fog without a lookout and without lights. That Wolf Larsen had turned the liquor loose among his men surprised me, but he evidently knew their psychology and the best method of cementing in cordiality what had begun in bloodshed. His victory over Death Larsen seemed to have had a remarkable effect on him. The previous evening he had reasoned himself into the blues, and I had been waiting momentarily for one of his characteristic outbursts. Yet nothing had occurred, and he was now in splendid trim. Possibly his success in capturing so many hunters and boats had counteracted the customary reaction. At any rate, the blues were gone, and the blue devils had not put in an appearance. So I thought at the time, but, ah me, little I knew him, or knew that even then perhaps he was meditating an outbreak more terrible than any I had seen. As I say, he discovered himself in splendid trim when I entered the cabin. While waiting for me, he had engaged Maud in an animated discussion. Temptation was the topic they had hit upon, and from the few words I heard, I made out that he was contending that temptation was temptation only when a man was seduced by it and fell.
"For look you," he was saying, "as I see it, a man does things because of desire. He has many desires. He may desire to escape pain or to enjoy pleasure, but whatever he does because he desires to do it."
But suppose he desires to do two opposite things, neither of which will permit him to do the other, Maud interrupted.
"The very thing I was coming to."
"And between these two desires is just where the soul of the man is manifest," she went on. "If it is a good soul, it will desire to do the good action, and contrary, if it is a bad soul. It is the soul that decides."
"Bosh and nonsense," he exclaimed impatiently.
Wolf Larsen seemed voluble, prone to speech as I had never seen him before. It was as though he were bursting with pent energy which must find an outlet somehow. Almost immediately, he launched into a discussion on love. As usual, his was the sheer materialistic side, and Maud's was the idealistic. For myself, beyond a word or so of suggestion or correction now and again, I took no part. He was brilliant, but so was Maud, and for some time I lost the thread of the conversation through studying her face as she talked. It was a face that rarely displayed color, but tonight it was flushed and vivacious. Her wit was playing keenly, and she was enjoying the tilt as much as Wolf Larsen, and he was enjoying it hugely. If ever Wolf Larsen attained the summit of living, he attained it then. From time to time I forsook my own thoughts to follow him, and I followed in a maze, mastered for the moment by his remarkable intellect, under the spell of his passion, for he was preaching the passion of revolt. It was inevitable that Milton's Lucifer should be instanced, and the keenness with which Wolf Larsen analyzed and depicted the character was a revelation of his stifled genius. Again, that unnameable and unmistakable terror was in her eyes, and she said, almost in a whisper, "You are Lucifer." The door closed and she was gone. He stood staring after her for a minute, then returned to himself and me.
"I'll relieve Lewis at the wheel," he said shortly, "and call upon you to relieve me at midnight. Better turn in now and get some sleep."
For a time I listened to the clamor in the steerage and marveled on the love which had come to me, but my sleep on the Ghost had become most healthful and natural, and soon the songs and cries died away. My eyes closed, and my consciousness sank down into the half-death of slumber. I knew not what had aroused me, but found myself out of my bunk, on my feet, wide awake, my soul vibrating to the warning danger as it might have thrilled to a trumpet call. I threw open the door. The cabin light was burning low. I saw Maud, my Maud, straining and struggling and crushed in the embrace of Wolf Larsen's arms. I could see the vain beat and flutter of her as she strove, pressing her face in his breast to escape from him. All this I saw on the very instant of seeing as I sprang forward. I struck him with my fist on the face as he raised his head, but it was a puny blow. He roared in ferocious, animal-like way and gave me a shove with his hand. It was only a shove, the flit of a wrist, yet so tremendous was his strength, I was hurled backward as from a catapult. I struck the door of the stateroom, which had formerly been Mudridge's, splintering and smashing the panels with the impact of my body. I struggled to my feet with difficulty, dragging myself clear of the wrecked door, unaware of any hurt whatever. I was conscious only to an overmastering rage. I think I, too, cried aloud as I drew the knife at my hip and sprang forward a second time. But something had happened. They were reeling apart. I was close on him, my knife uplifted, but I withheld the blow. I was puzzled by the strangeness of it. Maud was leaning against the wall, one hand out for support, but he was staggering, his left hand pressed against his forehead and covering his eyes. With the right, he was groping about him in a dazed sort of way. It struck against the wall, and his body seemed to express a muscular and physical relief at the contact, as though he had found his bearings, his location in space as well as something against which to lean. And I raised the knife to strike at a more vital part. But Maud had seen my first blow, and she cried, "Don't! Please don't!" I dropped my arm for a moment, and a moment only. Again the knife was raised, and Wolf Larsen would have surely died if she had not stepped between. I stepped back, separating from her, and replaced the knife in its sheath. I looked at Wolf Larsen. He still pressed his left hand against his forehead. It covered his eyes. His head was bowed. He seemed to have grown limp. His body was sagging at the hips. His great shoulders were drooping and shrinking forward. "Van Weyden," he called hoarsely, and with a note of fright in his voice. "Van Weyden, where are you?" "Help me to a seat," he said in the same hoarse, frightened voice. I must get to my bunk. Lend me a hand. I'll be all right in a little while. It's those damned headaches, I believe. I was afraid of them. I had a feeling. No, I don't know what I'm talking about. Help me to my bunk." "If you will wait, please, until I come back," I answered. I went on deck. Louis was at the wheel. "You may go forward and turn in," I said, taking it from him. He was quick to obey, and I found myself alone on deck of the Ghost. As quietly as possible, I cleaned up the topsails, lowered the flying jib and staysail, backed the jib over, and flattened the mainsail. I went below to Maud. I placed a finger on my lips for silence and entered Wolf Larsen's room. He was in the same position in which I had left him, and his head was rocking, almost writhing from side to side. Maud was waiting patiently for me. "Will you trust yourself to me for a journey of 600 miles or so?" I asked. "You mean?" she asked, and I knew she had guessed right. "Yes, I mean just that," I replied. "There's nothing left for us but the open boat." "Will you please dress as warmly as you can at once and make into a bundle whatever you wish to bring with you?" The lazarette was directly beneath the cabin, and opening the trap door in the floor and carrying a candle with me, I dropped down and began overhauling the ship's stores. I selected mainly from the canned goods, and by the time I was ready, willing hands were extended from above to receive what I passed up. We worked in silence. I helped myself also to blankets, mittens, oilskins, caps, and such things from the slop chest. There was no light adventure, this trusting ourselves in a small boat to so raw and stormy a sea, and it was imperative that we should guard ourselves against the cold and wet. We worked feverishly, carrying our plunder on deck and depositing it amidships, so feverishly that Maud, whose strength was hardly a positive quantity, had to give over, exhausted, and sit on the steps, and I re-entered Wolf Larsen's stateroom to get his rifle and shotgun. I spoke to him, but he made no answer, though his head was still rocking from side to side, and he was not asleep. "Goodbye, Lucifer," I whispered to myself as I softly closed the door. I had never rowed in my life, but I put the oars at the expense of much effort and got the boat clear of the Ghost. Then I experimented with the sail. I'd seen the boat steers and hunters set their sails many times, yet this was my first attempt. What took them possibly 2 minutes took me 20, but in the end I succeeded in settling and trimming it, and, with the steering oar in my hands, hauled up on the wind. "There lies Japan," I remarked, "straight before us." We turned our heads, swayed by a common impulse to see the last of Ghost. Her low hull lifted and rolled windward on a sea. Her canvas loomed darkly at night. Her lashed wheel creaked as the rudder kicked. Then sight and sound of her faded away, and we were alone on the dark sea.